All right, we had just got cut off when I was reading through Women on the Home Front. So let's get back to that. This is once again the 6.09 lesson, and we were here caring for the sick and wounded. All right, I'm going to start here in this middle paragraph. When the war broke out, Abraham Lincoln turned to Dorothea Dix, who had achieved fame for her work with the mentally ill as a superintendent of the Union Army nurses. Dix Dix quickly set about creating a professional nursing corps. When a female clerk at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington learned of the suffering of wounded Union troops, she collected medical supplies and went to care for the soldiers on the battlefield. Before long, this clerk, Clara Barton, had found a whole new calling. After the Civil War in 1881, she founded the American branch of the International Red Cross. In the South, while many women were hesitant to enter hospital wards, others rejected cultural conventions and threw themselves into nursing, both at home and in battlefield hospitals. After the first Battle of Bull Run, Sally Tompkins opened a hospital in Richmond, which she ran throughout the war. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was so impressed with her work that he gave her a military commission as a captain of cavalry. In both the North and South, thousands of women who followed the news of the war's progress at home supported the war effort in any way they could. As soon as fighting broke out, they formed sewing circles and other voluntary societies to help support their troops. Women rolled bandages, sewed clothing, or prepared packages stuffed with food, newspapers, and anything else the military did not supply. They made flags for use in battle. Before long, they were organizing visits to local hospitals where volunteers read to soldiers and did their best to offer aid and comfort. In the North, which enjoyed much greater wealth than the South, women staffed two national organizations, the United States Sanitary Commission, USSC, and the United States Christian Commission, USCC. The USSC sent medical and sanitary aid to the camps, while the USCC, it's confusing, agents delivered religious materials and food and clothing. These national groups had local auxiliaries in towns and cities across the North, where volunteers, mostly women, raised money to send goods to soldiers in the camps. In the second half of the war, women of the Sanitary Commission staged a series of impressive fundraising fairs. These fairs became grand celebrations of patriotism, where visitors could view a wide variety of exhibits while purchasing items to help raise money. The New York Fair alone raised over $1 million. The organizers of Chicago's Northwestern Sanitary Fair, one of the first and largest, got Abraham Lincoln to donate an autographed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, was sold at auction for $3,000. Writing and speaking out. Other women found more political ways to support the cause. Hundreds of women wrote newspaper editorials and letters to the editor, expressing their opinions even if they sometimes did not sign their full names. Diaries and letters revealed that in sitting rooms and meeting halls across the country, many other women were engaged in spirited arguments about politics and the war. A few, notably the young Quaker Philadelphian Anne Dickinson, became patriotic lecturers during the war. Known as America's Joan of Arc for her youthful vigor and sharp tongue, Dickinson attracted enormous crowds and periodic controversy. After a disastrous showing by Union troops in one battle, she declared that this battle was not lost through ignorance or incompetence, but through the treason of the commanding general George B. McClellan. Pro-war Republicans loved her fiery oratory, but some Democratic newspapers insisted that a woman had no place speaking in public. Women as soldiers and spies. Several hundred women went so far as to dress as men and serve in uniform. In a few cases, their true identities were not discovered until years after the war. Others took advantage of their gender to befriend enemy officers and then bring news of enemy movements to officers on other side. Often they simply passed on news they happened to overhear. But in a handful of celebrated cases, women in both the North and South served as highly successful spies, passing valuable information across enemy lines. Early in the war, Washington resident Rose O'Neal Greenhow passed information about Union movements to Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard before the First Battle of Bull Run. Greenhow was arrested and held in prison before federal officials banished her to Richmond, where she was welcomed as a heroine. Virginia native Elizabeth Van Loo spent the war living in Richmond's high society, while secretly aiding Northern prisoners of war and passing military information across the lines to the Union military. Not all Northerners sided with the Union, and not all white Southerners supported the Confederacy. Many in the North objected to the war, or at least opposed the draft, emancipation, and other government actions. As the war had dragged on, growing numbers of Southerners objected to Confederate policies. Wherever there was dissent, women took part, both in private writings and in occasional public resistance. In April 1863, Richmond erupted in bread riots over the cost of food and accusations that merchants were hoarding their goods. Most accounts agreed that women were chiefly responsible for these and other food riots. When rioters in New York City objected to the draft in July 1863, many of those arrested were women, many of whom had draft age sons. The war's legacy for women. What sort of legacy did the war leave for American women? Some occupations, particularly nursing, remained open to women after the war, and war widows, like surviving veterans, began to receive modest pensions from the federal government after the war. In some ways, the war indirectly changed women's roles in the long term. The war accelerated the growth of industry in the North, and in the post-war period, increasing numbers of women found work in the nation's factories and workshops. By the 1800s and 1890s, many women were also attending college and playing an active role in civic and volunteer associations, a development that might have taken longer had the war not challenged long-withstanding ideas about women's place in society. And that, I believe, is the last page that we were to read for this lesson. Yep, it starts a new chapter there. So here we are back on lesson 4.09. So let's look at the chapter highlights. 11 Southern slave states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as its president. 4 slave states, known as border states, remained in the Union: Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. The North had manufacturing strengths, railroads, and a standing army, and the South had experienced officers and was able to trade cotton for goods from Europe. 1861. The war began with Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. The first Battle of Bull Run ended expectations of a quick war. The Union used a naval blockade to try to choke off trade. Remember the Anaconda Plan. Snake going to coil around and choke them off. 1862. Ironclad ships, the Merrimack and Monitor, renamed for Pickles, or the Virginia, ironclad ships engaged in battle for the first time. The Union won victories at Forts Henry and Donelson and at New Orleans and Shiloh. The Confederacy won the Second Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Antietam in Maryland was the bloodiest day in American history. 1863. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederacy. No slaves were actually freed, but the effect was significant. Freed slaves and other African Americans were able to join the Union Army. The first all-black military regiment was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Confederates surrendered at Vicksburg as Confederate General Lee launched an unsuccessful attack on Gettysburg. Draft riots erupted in New York City and left more than 1,000 dead. Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, which reaffirmed the nation's ideals. 1864. Lincoln appointed Grant as head of Union forces. Lincoln was reelected after Sherman successfully took Atlanta. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified and ended slavery. 1865. Confederate General Lee surrendered to Union General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9th. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 15th at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The Civil War is considered the first modern war. Ironclads, hot air balloons, Gatling guns, and an early submarine changed warfare. The civilian population was involved more fully than ever before and saw the reality of war through the new medium of photography. Women participated in the war efforts as nurses, spies, and workers. The Civil War resulted in 620,000 deaths, innumerable wounded, and devastation of Southern farmland, homes, and businesses. But it answered constitutional questions of federal supremacy, ended the scourge of slavery, and confirmed a political and economic power shift to the North. And then don't forget to take your 6.09 quiz, which will cover several of the prior lessons. It should be covering lessons 6.05, 6.07, 6.08, and 6.09. So be sure to review all those lessons before you take this quiz. Good luck!